therefore I must exist. Or in a later treatise, sum res cogitans, I am a being that thinks. For Descartes, everything begins with thinking, with the conscious experience of thoughts and feelings and images and all of these things kind of passing through his mind. In Descartes' work, Descartes did two really important things. For philosophers, what Descartes did was to shift philosophy from an emphasis on metaphysics, that is, problems of existence, and ethics, that is, problems of right and wrong, to epistemology, that is, problems of knowledge. What do we know? How do we know it? How reliable is our knowledge? That's Descartes' big claim to fame in philosophy. But for our purposes, the other thing that Descartes did was that he got us thinking about consciousness in a way that people really hadn't been thinking about it before. And as we'll talk about in a week, after next week, he gave us what's known as the mind-body problem, which has bothered some philosophers and cognitive scientists ever since, about what the relationship is between mind and body, or put another way, how it is that physical processes in the brain and the rest of the nervous system can give rise to subjective mental states of thinking, believing, feeling, and knowing. So all that's in the 17th century, basically. For psychologists, the problem of consciousness really comes to the fore with the work of William James, the great American philosopher and psychologist who wrote the first big textbook on psychology, known as The Principles of Psychology. The very first page, the very first chapter of the Principles, James writes that psychology is the science of mental life, okay? Trying to figure out how the mind works. That's the job of psychology. He says the first fact for us then as psychologists is that thinking of some sort goes on. This is a direct reference to Descartes. I think, therefore I exist. The first thing that we know as psychologists is that thinking goes on, by which James meant conscious thinking. And in case there was any doubt about that, when he went to revise his textbook a couple years later, he redefined psychology as the description and explanation of states of consciousness as such. Okay, this is a central problem for psychology, and for that matter, for cognitive science as well. Now, there was a psychology before William James. There was a scientific psychology before William James, and it too was concerned with problems of consciousness. So, for example, the very earliest scientific psychologists, a group of investigators known as the psychophysicists, people like Fechner and Helmholtz, were interested in trying to make a science out of consciousness. And they said, look, what we can do is we can trace the relationships between people's private mental experiences and the objective stimulus conditions under which those experiences occur. So what psychophysics did, and where it got its name, basically, was by trying to figure out what the relations were between the physical properties of stimuli and the psychological properties of the experiences to which those stimuli gave rise. That was early in the 19th century. Later in the 19th century, we got a number of investigators like Wilhelm Wundt in Germany and E.B. Titchener in the United States, who employed a methodology known as experimental introspection to much the same effect. What they tried to do was to get people to introspect, to look into their own minds while they were having some kinds of experiences, and then try to describe those in ways that could be quantified in various ways. So for the entire 19th century, really, psychology as a science was a science of consciousness. This is how Fechner and Wundt, Fechner and Helmholtz thought about it early in the 19th century. That's how Wundt and Titchener thought about it, and James later on. Wundt's work is especially interesting because this structuralist program really kind of laid out the importance of consciousness for psychology very clearly. Wundt, at one point in his textbook, trying to make the distinction between psychology and other sciences, basically defined physics as the science of experience as independent of the individual. Physics is an objective science. It tries to understand things, how things work, independent of the person who is experiencing them. But Wundt made clear that psychology can't be a science like that. Psychology is the science of experience as dependent on the experiencing individual. And what Wundt and his colleagues tried to do was to engage in a kind of mental chemistry in which, through introspection, they tried to decompose complex mental experiences into their elementary components, decompose molecular experience, if you will, into atoms and for that matter, subatomic particles, although not subatomic particles really, elementary sensations and feelings. So all that's going on in the 19th century. In the early part of the 20th century, though, all of this came to a kind of grinding halt with what we know of as the behaviorist revolution. J.B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, and other people of his in his group were very dissatisfied with the scientific psychology that was available at the time, and their dissatisfaction really boiled down to a dissatisfaction with introspection. They said, look, science is by its very nature objective. The whole point of science is to develop an objective, observer-independent understanding of how the world works. But introspection, where you look into your own mind, is necessarily subjective. How are we going to find out whether your reports are correct? There's just no way to do that. Science depends on public observation, and consciousness is necessarily a private experience. So the way to make psychology a science is to get rid of consciousness. And that's exactly what they did. What the behaviorists did was to focus our attention on objectively observable behavior and to basically abjure all references to internal private mental states of consciousness like feelings and beliefs and all of that stuff. This is a wholesale abandonment of the mind and of any reference to any kind of mentalistic construct in favor of an analysis of behavior that entailed tracing the functional or the statistical relations between environmental stimuli, which could be objectively observed and counted and measured, and behavioral responses, which could be objectively observed and measured without any interest or reference to anything that might go on in between in the head of the observer. That lasted for a long time. Watson writes Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist in 1919. As late as 1953, as late as 1963, one form of behaviorism or another dominated scientific psychology both in America and in the rest of the world. That doesn't mean that consciousness went away. There were some individuals and some groups of psychologists who maintained a persisting interest in consciousness and in mental life. Chief among these were the Gestalt psychologists who were interested in perceptual organization, which meant they were interested in perception, which meant they were interested in perceptual experience, not just in behavior. There was a psychologist not read anymore named McDougall, who developed a psychology that was thoroughly mentalistic, talking about both cognitions and emotion and motivation, which the behaviorists never did. And then there were investigators like Woodworth, who were interested in problems like the span of apprehension. How many things can you keep in mind at one time? Okay, now that's not a question a behaviorist would ever ask, right? And leading to a famous paper by George Miller on the magical number 7 plus or minus 2 on the capacity of short-term memory. That paper is one of the founding documents of what came to be known as the cognitive revolution in psychology, because for the first time, people were looking at the mind again, okay? How many things can you hold in your mind? What's going through your mind when you're paying attention? So early cognitive psychology focused on problems like selective attention. How can we pay attention to one thing and ignore other kinds of things? On primary memory, what's going through people's mind at any particular moment. Even early studies of mental imagery, which was certainly nothing that the behaviorists wanted anything to do with. And what happened is, as the cognitive revolution built, people began to think that it would be legitimate to take an interest in consciousness and in mental life again. Those were the positive effects of the cognitive revolution, but there were some negative effects as well, and we'll see those a little bit later in the course. One of these is the reliance of early cognitive psychology on the computer metaphor of the mind, that the mind is software and everything else is kind of hardware. And if you think about the mind as a computer, that will take you a long way, but nobody ever claimed that a computer was conscious. So if you thought seriously that the mind was some kind of computer, then it became possible to think about mental life without thinking about consciousness at all. It's the other side of the coin here. Moreover, people like Noam Chomsky, in his arguments about the nature of language, argued that our ability to use language was based on a set of unconscious capacities, the things that we didn't know anything about through introspection, and we could know only through inference. And then more recently, as you'll see again after next week, this led to a group of cognitive psychologists basically thinking, not unlike the behaviorists, that references to consciousness are really part of folk psychology. When your grandmother talks about psychology, she talks about things like consciousness. That's not real science. And what we really ought to do is to focus on things like neurons and synapses and neurotransmitters and things like that. This is, in my view, just another way of abandoning the mental, right? It's not all that different from what Watson was talking about with behaviorism. Okay, but all of this lays kind of a background here for what the philosopher Owen Flanagan has called a stance of conscious shyness that infects philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science, which is to say that we are really pretty nervous about consciousness. There is a reason that there aren't too many textbooks devoted to consciousness. There's a reason there aren't too many classes like this devoted to consciousness, and that is that it makes people feel funny somehow to talk about it. This conscious shyness expresses itself in a couple of features of modern psychology and cognitive science that Flanagan pointed out really nicely. One is what he called positivistic reserve. Psychologists and cognitive scientists prefer to deal with things that they can see and touch and feel and count and measure, okay? We like public observation. That leads to a stance of kind of what you might call methodological behaviorism. All we have in psychology really are self-reports and button presses. That's the data for psychology, okay? But it's